We are delighted and honored to have with us today Dr. Robert Lehman. Dr. Lehman has a distinguished career as a musician in the Episcopal Church. He's held positions at Washington National Cathedral, Princeton University Chapel, St. Bartholomew's in New York, and 14 years at Christ Church, New Haven, Connecticut. Additionally, Dr. Lehman has an active life as a practitioner and philosopher of all things sacred music and liturgy, with his ties to the Royal School of Church Music course in Newport, and also the American Sarum Conference, which is an interdisciplinary gathering of clergy and musicians to get at the questions surrounding liturgy and music in a really unique way. So, Dr. Lehman, welcome. I can't think of anyone better with whom to be having this conversation.
Well, thank you, David. I appreciate that. Very kind.
So I've billed this conversation as sort of lions and tigers and bears, oh my, processions, preces, and prayer. And I thought those kinds of things could sort of guide our conversation today. The first one, processions, is sort of how most of our services in the Episcopal Church start. So in the morning, most Episcopalians are familiar with a very joyful entrance procession that involves singing, and usually a counterpart at the end, a procession that leaves the front of the church once again with singing. At Evensong, we still see a procession. It's a quieter kind of procession, and in many places, sort of a procession of an utterly different character. It's quite slow. The pace of the choir is quite slow, and the goal of the procession is, I think, to set the tone for the service that follows. Would you do some reflecting on that? And I'm especially interested in your perspective on that with your work in the American Sarum Conference. I know that I think there was even a whole conference dedicated to processions.
Yeah, indeed. The idea of a procession, one really needs to parse it out, I think. The processions that you have just described really are functional processions. They serve a purpose, and that is getting from point A to point B. If the choir is in the back of the church or off in some vesting room somewhere, there needs to be a way to get them into the choir stalls. The clergy need to get to the altar from wherever it is that they are at a Eucharistic liturgy. And so what you've described is really a matter of function and nothing else. The opening hymn that we sing that gets the choir and the clergy from point A to point B is merely a substitute for the ancient introit, from the minor propers of the Mass. We have developed that into generally an opening hymn, and it serves no purpose as far as movement is concerned, apart from getting from point A to point B. One can argue that it unites everybody's voice in song. It's a way to call the assembly together into a common voice and that sort of thing. And that's all well and good and true. And I wouldn't ever advocate changing it. But they're not a real procession. A real procession is something that is not nearly as functional. A real procession actually begins at the altar and generally returns to the altar. And probably the best known example of that people know is the Great Litany. The Great Litany begins in place, and you do the big pretzel turning left around the church and return to the choir stalls and the altar.
And this is sometimes called a solemn procession, isn't it? When you start from the altar and you return to the altar.
Well, right. Although solemn has connotations also. Generally, the word solemn means there's incense involved.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're right. So I guess my only thinking about the sort of point A to point B procession, the one with which most churches are familiar, starting from the back in some way and then ending at the front, ready to start the service, there is a liturgical choice in that, that the element of gathering people together, being led in, typically by a cross, in other places by a verger or some other leader of the procession. Um, that is a clear alternative to just having people sort of find their places in the choir on their own. So I think it's already sort of a liturgical decision that we're entering as a body. Am I off base on that?
No, I think by and large you're quite right. And quite frankly, a procession means whatever you say it means. Uh, if you want to describe it as something that is beyond function, uh, to get from the back of the church to the front, well, that's fine. There's no right or wrong. There's only history.
Mhm.
And so you can say this is a something that goes well beyond function. Yes, it gets us from point A to point B, but it also, and those things we mentioned before, it's symbolic of us entering the worship space. It unites everybody in a common voice. It introduces the musical element right off the bat. It can mean whatever you say it means.
Okay. So I guess, and then a related question to that is, let's get into kind of the alternative procession, the historic roots of these other kinds of processions. So I understand at Salisbury Cathedral there was a courtyard, a square-shaped courtyard that came off the building of the church. And so was it often the case that processions would actually leave the nave of the church itself and sort of walk around the square and then re-enter the church?
Oh,
And
all the time.
mm,
Yeah, at Salisbury, they they needed no excuse to move, and they did it all the time. And particularly at the first Sarum Cathedral, um, Old Sarum, the ruins are there, and you can still walk the procession routes. And one of the most uh, intricate and involved processions was their Palm Sunday procession that they did, that just went everywhere and stopped everywhere for a station here and a station there. And very, very interesting, very time consuming, and you certainly would be helpful in getting in your 10,000 steps. But it was then something that they moved into the new cathedral, which is 900 years old. Um, and to this day, they still parade around for various occasions.
so is there any kind of accumulated weight that we've received in our sort of normal Sunday morning processions today? Have we inherited some kind of symbolism without knowing it? And I guess the reason I'm asking the question is because I can imagine a very sort of low church Virginia, Virginia sort of being the bastion of low church Anglicanism that I can think of. In fact, the church that I'm sitting in right now is actually architecturally modeled on a sort of Virginia colonial church. Um, in many places, probably it was a clergy person by himself without a choir. So I could imagine there not really being a procession, but the service sort of simply beginning when the clergy person arrived. And so even with the introduction of a choir, I'm also thinking of places that had a West Gallery music tradition.
Right.
Um, that these things kind of go hand in hand, I guess. The having the vested choir and having the procession. So um, thinking of that more as a liturgical style or a liturgical choice, have we inherited some kind of symbolism to that other than gathering or other than going from point A to point B?
Well, sure. For instance, the Great Litany uh, is a penitential procession. It always turns left uh, because a penitential procession is symbolic of the Israelites wandering through the desert for 40 years, seemingly with no destination, though they've been promised one. Uh, Biblically, left is a side of weakness, and that's why a penitential procession turns to the right. I mean, excuse me, to the left. Um, the right side is the side of strength, God's right hand. So festal processions always turn to the right. That's something we've inherited that probably is not given a great deal of thought in a lot of places. Um, it's fascinating how many colleagues, just in the course of discussion, um, will will reveal that they had no idea, what way the procession is supposed to turn, and there's historical precedent for all of it.
Mhm.
Uh, and those who come from a less liturgical background or tradition might argue that it's silly, which maybe it is. But it's also fascinating that at some point, this has really been thought through. And so all sorts of traditions we've inherited. Yeah. Um, Christmas Eve, a procession is, no doubt symbolic of the journey to Bethlehem. Um, uh, an Easter Day procession is no doubt symbolic of beginning at the altar, the Christocentric part of everything, and going out into the world to spread the good news of the resurrection, etc.
Mhm. And you did mention the Palm Sunday procession too, which probably, if an Episcopal Church does no other procession beginning at the altar, that could be the one that they would recognize on that day.
Right. Although I would dare venture to guess that most churches in their Palm Sunday procession actually begin outside the church, which is certainly a traditional way of doing that.
Right.
It's a procession to get into the church, which is both reflective of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, but it's also very functional. You got to get in the church somehow.
Right. Right. And so bringing our conversation back to Evensong, that's ultimately sort of what we're talking about. It's sort of a dignified way for a choir to enter together,
Right.
rather than just having the choir filter into their seats one by one.
Which is exactly what you see in a monastic community,
right.
where the body of monks or nuns or whatever it is, um, they are the choir, and they just come and randomly take their seats.
Right. So with the monastic tradition of Vespers and Compline, from which our service of Evensong comes, that would have been part of the tradition historically. It would just be the gathering of individual voices, one by one.
Right.
Okay, good. Well, I want to move on now to something more specific to Evensong, which is the Preces. So we have some words to define with this conversation, I think. And I'm not sure that I'm going to define them correctly. So I'm hoping I can get your help in this. When you see a published copy of this music, you usually see it listed Preces and responses. But the more that I look at the service of Evensong, the more I wonder if that order isn't backwards, the way that liturgical scholars seem to talk about these things. I think usually the versicles and responses at the beginning of the service, "O Lord, open thou our lips, and our mouth shall show forth thy praise." I think more often than not, those are sort of referred to as the responses. And the suffrages, that's another word for these things that you get later. And if you've got a prayer book at home, I'm on page 67. And the prayer book, the 79 prayer book, refers to them as suffrages. "O Lord, show thy mercy upon us," and the response, "and grant us thy salvation." So that whole series of prayers that begin that way, I think those are called the Preces. So rather than Preces and responses, based on the way the service itself is ordered, should we be referring to these things rightly as responses and Preces?
Well, I think that's digging a little too deep. I I would assert that the responses refer only to the responses, the R's, but all the V's and R's.
Okay.
Um,
So
the,
in other words, the parts that are sung chorally by the choir.
right, and the Preces that's ordinarily that refers to those that precede the psalmody, and the suffrages are those that fall in the body of the service, the prayers following the creed. And both incorporate responses.
Right.
Um, and so, you can have that discussion and call it anything you want, I suppose. Uh,
Well, it is okay. I think it's worth talking about because it is a little bit confusing that there's sort of three terms that can be used for all these things, almost as a standalone term. So just so that our everyone viewing this conversation is clear, preces, responses, and also the word suffrages. Eh, Really, you can use one of those words to refer to the whole
well,
phenomenon.
no, not really,
Not
because
really.
the suffrages are those that follow the creed.
Okay.
The preces are those that precede the psalmody. So there are really two parts. There's the preces and responses, and the suffrages and responses.
Oh, okay.
And just the shorthand is responses. That just connotes all of it.
All of it.
Yeah,
Response. So,
and understanding that it's all encompassing.
no, thank you for correcting me. So the safe word to use is responses.
I think so.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Good. So now that we've thoroughly muddled the issue, um, this is one of the parts of the service of Evensong that sort of seems to be um, the most susceptible to sort of minor changes. So in looking at the very first service of Evensong, the very first Book of Common Prayer, and then going to 1552, 1559, and finally 1662, you just see little, just sort of very little minor tweaks to the beginning of the service. So that one of the things we're left with now is with the current prayer book, the 1979 prayer book. They've sort of gone back, I think, to the original service of evening prayer in the first Book of Common Prayer, by omitting the very first uh, response at the beginning of the service. "O Lord, open thou our lips." So that doesn't appear in the 1979 prayer book, I think, in an interest to sort of get at the service
It,
as it was
it
done.
does not appear at Evensong,
Right, not at
but
Evensong.
it does appear at morning prayer.
Hmm.
Um, and the reason for that, of course, is because uh, this was the first thing that came out of the monks' mouths early in the morning after the great silence, which would follow Compline. So the first thing that was said was, "O Lord, open our lips so that we can proclaim praise."
Hmm.
Uh, and when you're in church 8 times a day, the 8 offices, by the time you get to the office number 7, Vespers, or you've been praying and all day, and your lips have been open for quite some time, which is, I think, the thinking, um,
In the prayer book.
yeah, right, surrounding that omission.
Well, that's interesting then. So the 1979 prayer book sort of assumes that you have also prayed morning prayer that day.
I
Um, and
believe so.
and this is sort of worth noting that the way the prayer book refers to these services is daily morning and daily evening prayer. So this is something I wonder about encouraging our congregations, and maybe you do too, that there is a sense in which just coming to Evensong on a Sunday evening is sort of not enough. I mean, it's almost as if that is part of a bigger cycle and bigger continuum of the daily offices which are provided for in the prayer book. And so if you really want the full experience, there's some private prayer that you could be doing at home or in a small group and keeping up the daily office during the week, and then having your attendance at a service of choral evensong being sort of a more public manifestation of what's going on for you privately.
Right, absolutely. The I don't know if it's still there or not, but in I can't remember if it was Canterbury or Coventry, but one of those two cathedrals always published a little thing that said, "Welcome," et cetera, et cetera. You're joining an ongoing conversation that began long before you were born, and it will continue long after you leave this place, and you're just popping in on the conversation. And I think that's a wonderful way to think about the daily offices. They are a part of an absolute continuum.
Right. There was something, so in my introduction to this Living Tradition series, I did go back and take a very close look at the first prayer books. And something that interested me was, I think it was in the second Book of Common Prayer, 1552. That was the year that the word Alleluia was introduced. And it appeared alongside Praise Ye the Lord. It was sort of like they had to translate that word. And then, I think I have that backwards. The phrase "Praise ye the Lord" appeared in addition to Alleluia. But then the Alleluia was dropped because they thought, well, maybe people don't know what that word means in Latin. Let's just translate it into English and let the English stand alone. So the "Praise ye the Lord" endured. And of course, this is another thing that's sort of come full cycle now with the modern prayer book. If you go by the letter of the 1979 prayer book, you don't see "Praise ye the Lord." You see "Alleluia" only.
Right.
Yeah. So this creates a tension then with the choral tradition, because we have these wonderful composed settings, I think most of which grew up in the lead up and after the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. These things were sort of established then in a choral tradition. And then people like yourself have continued to compose music for the responses for Evensong using the same text. So then if you're faithful to that text, it's the "Praise ye the Lord" that you're setting to music and not the word Alleluia.
Yes, that's right. I suppose this is the point where, in defense, one argues that they do mean the same thing, and one invokes the rubric on page, I don't have a prayer book in front of me. It's 13 or 14.
About
That's
using, yeah,
about all previously authorized texts can be substituted for the corresponding texts.
right. No, I think it is an interesting thing to point out to people who, for whatever reason, are following along with a service of choral evensong from the prayer book, and they see that at this moment in particular, things don't really quite match up with what's on the page, and I think it's interesting to get at why.
Yeah, and very few places that do choral evensong actually follow the rite that's prescribed in the 1979 prayer book. Probably for the sole reason that the bulk of repertoire available is in fact setting earlier forms.
Namely the 1662 service of evensong. Yeah. There's another one of the suffrages that necessarily has to change throughout time. Um, "O Lord, save the King." When there's not a king on the throne in England, it becomes "O Lord, save the Queen." And then in the United States, the custom, it seems to be "O Lord, save the state." That's something that we just sort of edit ourselves in the published copy of music. In the prayer book itself, it's rendered slightly differently. "Lord, keep this nation under thy care."
Yeah.
So, yeah, have we done enough to sort of update the 1662, given that we don't live in a monarchy? Does it matter what kind of government we're living under when we sing these prayers?
No, I don't think so. I'd be interested to know what you think. Uh, it's and I think the translation of the state, or keep this nation under thy care, it indicates that we do not have a monarch, but one has to view and fully understand that the English regard the sovereign as the head of the church. I mean, the divine right of kings. These are people ordained by God Himself, and we don't have anything like that. And so, what the best that we can do is to pray for our nation, and or whatever the protectorate is. And I think the American prayer books have actually done a very admirable job of that.
Sure.
I think the choice of words is very good. Of course, one has to understand that the state refers to the country, and not one of 50 smaller entities.
Right. Um, One of the reasons I was so interested to have this conversation with you is because you've set the Preces and responses to music multiple times. So I wondered if you could talk about your process for doing that and why those words seem to interest you so much as a composer that I have to be honest, I don't know the number, but it's at least 3 or 4. Maybe you can enlighten me and tell me how many times you've done it.
Well, I think it's 9 or 10. Um, but the process is one that's really basic. The reason I've done it is in a couple of instances I've been asked to do it, but in the others, just for a new set. Um, in my career, I've been places where we sing Evensong all the time, and I've been, where we sing it once a month. Well, when you sing it once a month, the need for new settings, it doesn't seem nearly as urgent. But when you're singing it all the time, uh, you want something new and something fresh. Um, but I always defer to the primacy of the text and the way that the text would be spoken by a good lector, good reader, good actor. The word rhythms are important. For instance, "O Lord, make haste to help us." Almost invariably, if I'm setting it, is going to be to a faster moving set of notes than something else. To try to paint the haste. Uh, O Lord, open thou our lips, and our mouths shall show forth thy praise. The first thing that would come to my mind if I were going to try to set that right now is a closed mouth and the mouth opening, which says to me to begin maybe on a unison somewhere around middle C, and I have a big chord spread out. Picture a mouth opening up, and that sort of thing. Uh, the first set of responses that I ever did that were published, uh, it was written for a friend of mine, and there's a little musical joke in there. There's and bless our inheritance, or bless thy inheritance. I can't even remember, but the joke is there's a little musical reference in that to a musical experience that friend and I had in our past. Um, no one on earth would know that. Um, but it was my little way of referencing inheritance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's great.
Yeah, so it's always a primacy of text.
So given that you have tried your hand at this, a number of times, when you evaluate someone else's preces and responses, what kinds of things are you looking for? I mean, what in your mind makes a successful composition? And these are sort of unusual pieces of music that you have, very short phrases. You have a phrase for a cantor, you have a phrase for a choir. There's nothing really else quite like this. I mean, obviously this genre is a staple of the Anglican tradition, but elsewhere in choral music, you don't really find stuff like this.
No. Uh, when looking at a set of responses that someone else has done, what I always look for whether the rule of primacy of text has been observed, and it's easy to tell when someone has allowed musical considerations or a musical idea to overshadow what the text is trying to do. There's one set that the composer will remain anonymous, but there's one set that out there in regular use where in the middle of a sentence there's a rest, and it makes no sense at all unless it's being sung in a building that is so reverberant that the hearer wouldn't be able to detect that there was a big gaping hole in the middle of a sentence, and it would just sound, like perhaps a little comma or something. But I think that's a clear example of someone putting musical concerns over the concerns of the text.
I see. And I think it also expresses a need for some judgment there on the part of the organist and or choir master choosing the music, that the scope and the style of the music chosen works for the architecture in which it's used.
Right. And the architecture is another enormous consideration. I mean, we all know the stories of Howells and his evening canticles for the various buildings, but if one is composing a set of responses for one place in particular, then that the acoustics of that building certainly are are coming into play.
Yeah. So with your repertoire of responses in particular, does it span the gamut between pieces that would work in a sort of dry, typically American acoustic, and things that would work in a Washington National Cathedral or Princeton University Chapel?
Yeah, or in my case, I wrote a set for Duke Chapel,
Mm-hmm.
and those the harmonic language is slower, uh, note values are longer, and the, the sole reason for that was because of the very generous acoustic in that beautiful building.
That's great. You mentioned Howells, and so that brought to mind his really kind of unusual set of Preces and responses.
Rarely heard.
Rarely heard, I think, partially because of the difficulty in tuning them. I mean, there's a sort of utterly baffling modulation that happens at some point in the middle. Maybe it's actually his composed setting of the Lord's Prayer that occurs. But it is interesting that someone who is so widely acknowledged as a master of setting the canticles of the Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis only tried his hand at the Preces and responses once, and the result of that was a setting that's not often used.
I Yeah, and I think the reason it's not been often used is its sheer difficulty. They're really hard, and for something that happens in exactly the same way at every single service, every single day, um, the prudent choirmaster does not want to set aside a lot of time to work on the responses when there are canticles and an anthem and psalms to be sung. And I think that's why one rarely, if ever, hears the Howells responses. Is it is such a sucker up of rehearsal time that it leaves the little time to engage with the other music for the service.
Yeah. So I have to say I do enjoy your settings of the Preces and responses, of which I know. I think I only know a handful, so I need to get the full 9 and familiarize myself. Um,
Maybe you need to commission a set for St. Peter's Ledoux.
that could happen too. But of the other composers who have written Preces and responses that you've sung or that you know of, who do you think has really excelled at doing this? Who has some of the best sets in your mind, really from any time period?
I love the Philip Moore set that he did for Guildford Cathedral. Um, I think the William Smith responses are wonderful. They're so simple and so forthright and just fit the bill beautifully. Um, I'm very fond of the Sumption responses. Again, nice, simple, straightforward. Um, and there are lots of others that just aren't immediately popping into my mind. But and generally, I think simpler is better.
Mhm.
and that's another indictment against the Hull set. Um, but simpler is better. Again, because of primacy of text, it's about the words that are being sung. The music is its function is to enhance the words, not to obscure them.
Right. And I guess part of that is the form of the words themselves, that, we do have these little sentences. And so to get overly involved in one sentence, knowing that there's got to be a cadence and a stop and a return to the cantor, or in some complex settings, sometimes the cantor choir designation is obscured, but typically that's not the case. Anyway, I think that that's sort of an argument against over complexity and transparency of textual communication.
Right, and which can be realized or violated or in a number of different ways, certainly by numbers of notes, numbers of melismatic passages, texture, thickness, tempo, note durations, and jarring harmonic movements. There are all ways, there are all sorts of ways to obscure texts and work against them.
So one final question, sort of on this area. In the Book of Common Prayer, the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, there is an alternative set of suffrages, the prayers sung after the creed, and they're really rather lovely, I think. I believe they were a composition for the 1979 book, or this was certainly their first appearance in a Anglican prayer book. That this evening may be holy, good, and peaceful, we entreat thee, O Lord. That thy holy angels may lead us in paths of peace and goodwill, we entreat thee, O Lord. So it continues in that vein. That's page 68 of the prayer book. It's a different approach to the suffrages, in that it has a consistent response from the congregation or from the
It's more
choir.
of a litany.
Yeah, a choral litany, you said? Are you familiar with any composed settings of those alternative suffrages?
I'm afraid not, not a one.
Okay.
That's not to say that they don't exist. I just am not familiar with a single setting.
Because I'm familiar with only one, and that's a setting by Professor Stephen Plank at Oberlin College that we sang at an evensong at Trinity Cathedral in Cleveland. And they've always stuck with me because it was just so unusual to hear those sung at
Yeah.
evensong. And he treated the response in a really sort of ingenious way. So that's sort of on my wish list to get that score from him, actually, and sing them here. I think it would be sort of
Wouldn't
uh,
that be wonderful? Yeah.
a surprising alternative to the predominant choral tradition at
Mhm.
evensong. Good.
Yeah. Oh, that would be wonderful. And wouldn't it be wonderful to get some more people writing?
I think so too. Yeah, those are, I think, because of the preponderance of the weight of the tradition around this music, that additional text has been sort of unjustly ignored in terms of music. I think it would be nice to have more ways to sing those words.
Mhm. Agreed.
So we have been talking about prayer this whole time, but I want to sort of end our conversation today with a longer discussion about prayer in the service of evensong, and maybe in the liturgy generally. Um, we've been talking about sung prayers. The preces and responses typically end with a cantor, or typically the officiant, singing the collects for the day, singing the prayers, usually 3, sometimes 4, for the service of evensong, and the choir responding with an amen. Once these prayers have concluded, then it's sort of up to the officiant to go into other prayers, ending with the prayer of Saint Chrysostom, the general thanksgiving and or prayer of Saint Chrysostom. Um, can you just reflect on this progression that we have, from the Lord's Prayer all the way through the suffrages, the collects, and then the transition into spoken prayers? Um, the way that I've experienced the service of evensong, it can be so musically intense, that I find sort of almost a welcome respite from the music, that we can just sort of pull back and have the officiant sort of pray in spoken words. Do you have a similar reaction to that pacing of the service of evensong? And if so,
I'm
what does that distinction mean, sung versus spoken?
Yeah, well, I do. It's the I'm one of the few church musicians I think you'll ever meet that actually advocates for not singing things. Uh, and I think at the close of the office, uh, those additional prayers, the general thanksgiving, the prayer of St. John Chrysostom, all these things are sort of extra official, if you will, or extra liturgical. Uh,
That is true, because as I've found in my recent refamiliarization with the early prayer books, they don't appear. I mean, the
right,
office simply ends.
right. And so I think it sets the office apart. If the after the final amen, if then additional prayers are spoken, we're here. We've said our prayers, but as long as we're here, let's say a few more about things that are pertinent to this day, or to this community or this region, this city, this country. And there's an intimacy about the spoken word that does not exist, I think, in in singing. Although conversely, there's great intimacy in singing that does not exist in the spoken word. But I think it's a good way to set off what has been sung and to then intimately address the the current needs of these other entities. Um, and to allow the sung office, the daily prayer that changes very little from day to day, to just leave it to reverberate in the space forever. I think it's a wonderful way to create um, a separation.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you're right, and necessarily, more immediate needs are best addressed through the spoken word, because it's hard to compose music to speak to, whatever sort of current events or current needs in the parish need to be prayed for. I mean, that best comes from the officiant stall and not the choir.
Right. Very few parishes have budgets to support newly composed settings of prayers for the immediacy of some situation.
Right. So, but thinking about this, the equation, I guess, as it were, of singing versus sung, um, that famous quote of Saint Augustine's, that he or she who sings prays twice. There is kind of an intensity, I think, to all of the prayer that is sung. The Lord's Prayer is, if it's not sung to a composed setting, it's chanted on a monotone by the choir and often the congregation. So we do have this sort of musical intensity that permeates that whole part of the service. Um, is it good to pray once? I mean, what does Augustine's aphorism mean in relation to this shift to spoken prayers at the end of the office?
Uh, I'm not sure it means anything, and uh, there is. I think what Augustine said is merely a testimony to the power of music and the concept of incarnation and the extension of incarnation into making music and how uh, creation continues through the making of music. It does not make any prayer more earnest or more sincere, just I think by singing it. But what it does is it just incorporates another level of humanity into it.
That's good. No, thank you. I painted you into a corner with that very awkward question, and thank you for getting me out of it. Um, there's a there is an intimacy that is able to be communicated through a skilled officiant at this point in the service. And you hear that so well in the weekly broadcasts of Evensong from the BBC. Obviously, these people know that they have a sort of international audience at that point, but I can attest to being in person at Evensongs in England, that it's always done with that same level of care and sort of a poetic sensibility, really. I think that's just so valuable to have that kind of preparation and skill from the priest at that moment, because it is a wonderful complement to the necessary preparation that the musicians have done all along from the opening versicles all the way through the end of the collects. I mean, that's a massive amount of music to sing. So
Right.
that if the response liturgically from the officiant's chair is one that bespeaks equal preparation, I think that's a really fulfilling way to experience that liturgy.
Well, and of course, we should be mindful that 9 times out of 10, the officiant at Evensong in the English cathedrals uh, are the officiant is the precentor, and the precentors are highly trained musicians, and so they fully understand the relationship between music and the spoken word and the interpretation of texts. And it's an example that we could all learn from, that people who officiate, uh, not everyone has the background that's going to allow them to do it as well as some others.
Right. No, I think you are right that so often it's a former choir boy or someone who's sung or at least very familiar with the sort of English choral tradition that's a partner in that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, I think those are sort of the points that I wanted to hit as far as processions, preces, and prayers. Is there anything else that comes to mind that this conversation has sparked for you?
I could go on forever, David, and I think it's probably better that I don't begin.
Yeah.
I, you wouldn't get dinner.
In that case, we'll have to have you back for another version of this talk.
That would be delightful. I'd love to do that.
Good. Well, and I want to say the sections of this conversation were so rich with musical examples that when we post this video, I want to make sure that underneath the video there's a long list of links to some of the music that we were talking about, so that viewers can go and listen to Howell's canticles and even
Yeah.
Howell's responses and things like that. So we'll try to make this a sort of multimedia experience available for people.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for this installation, this installment of the Living Tradition series. We're going to continue this series next month. Actually, today is sort of an auspicious day. We would normally be beginning our Evensong series here in the church on the second Sunday of October. Obviously, this year that is not meant to be, so we're continuing with this series instead. And we will pick this up on the second Sunday of November next month, when our special guest will be Dr. Mark Ardrey Graves, and he's going to be talking about psalms and canticles and things like that. So I hope you'll join us then. Everything in connection to these conversations can be found online at livingtradition.online. Very easy link to type into your browser and find a rich and ever-growing body of material around music and liturgy, especially as it ties to St. Peter's Church. So Dr. Lehman, thank you very, very much for being with us. And
My pleasure. Thank you.
we'll look forward to having you again soon.